Hey everybody, this is Brendan. I got some writing advice for you. And okay, so today we're going to be talking about something that I call the X-Files problem that come up in lots of science fiction and horror and urban fantasy and even like alternate world fantasy too, maybe some of the time. In order to talk about this, let me paint a picture for you. Let me set up a scenario, and it helps if you're familiar with the TV show The X-Files. But since that's quickly becoming a generational issue, I think even if you don't know the details, if you kind of know genre-y stuff, you can probably figure it out. Okay, so we have two FBI agents. We have Mulder, kind of handsome, curmudgeonly, smoldering, intuitive guy that like believes in sort of like lots of weird stuff and is the person to sort of point out where it's just like, hey, I think this might be a monster or a witch or ancient curse or ghost or whatever. And then we have Scully, who is a medical doctor, a woman of science and reason that, it's like ghosts, nonsense, there's no such thing. We have science. Okay. So we have, and they're partners, and they bicker, and they investigate stuff, right? So let's say we're at the beginning of an X-Files episode where we have these two people trot out to this terrible crime scene, and someone has been murdered in some kind of a disturbing way, right? And we find out that this person was involved with some kind of a weird cult that worships a space fungus from beyond time. All right. Now, at this point, Scully sort of takes a look at the body and says, like, okay, I know that this cult claims to worship a space fungus from beyond time, but looking at this, it's pretty clear that this person was just sort of like stabbed, maybe by a bunch of cultists. That's doing cultist stuff where they sort of like murdered this person, and then Mulder's going in the corner and says, maybe that's what it is, or. And then, takes a second to sort of smolder, takes a second to sort of like suggest that he's in tune with some like kind of wider frequencies. Maybe we have a space fungus from beyond time situation on our hand here. At which point, Scully is going to say, no, I don't think that just because the cults, we have cults, okay? Cults believe all kinds of crazy stuff. Probably all the stuff the cults believe is not actually true. The fact that this person might have died, maybe they just died because of like cult stuff. They upset the cult that they were in, and then the cult did their cult thing, and yeah. And that's we don't have to get the space fungus into it. We don't really have any empirical evidence for the space fungus. I've never seen a space fungus. I don't believe it's anything. And Mulder says, well, maybe, but we'll see. Or maybe it's because, man, I'm getting a space fungus feeling about this. And then probably what's going to happen, there's exceptions, and I don't want to be selling the X-Files short because, they thwarted this sometimes and sort of went against type sometimes. But usually, over the course of the episode, Scully is probably going to get proven wrong, and probably Mulder's going to be proven right in that something involved in this person's death is going to be involving the space fungus beyond time that we hitherto is not something that is sort of known to human understanding, that we had no particular evidence for, that was not really the most straightforward like explanation for whatever it is that they're investigating in the first place. Usually, the way that it goes is that Mulder is right and Scully is wrong. All right. And this is where we get to the problem part, because this is, despite the fact that, generally speaking, in the course of real-world murder investigation, as I understand it, I'm not a professional, but generally the way that this goes is that Mulder is not going to be wrong, right? The person that actually, that all that like science and reason and evidence and sort of like, okay, let me take a look at this and let me think about the way that I understand the world to actually work in my experience and in the experience of others. And, using principles that have been, tested independently and proven repeatable and all these things, as opposed to this sort of weird leap into sort of the supernatural, which is not something that is actually a real thing. Because, in fact, over here, there really is no supernatural. If you think otherwise, okay, I'll talk about that later, right? And if you think otherwise, we can talk about that. But let's just say for a second that we don't really think that the supernatural is a thing, right? In a situation like that, Scully's going to be correct, and Scully not just happen to be correct, but also smarter, better, more advisable, better judgment, the person that we want to be in charge. And Mulder is just kind of a crazy person most of the time, right? And the trick here is that when we're writing stories with sort of supernatural elements, or with elements that sort of go beyond things that we're familiar with, so things like, like horror, fantasy, some kinds of science fiction sometimes, stuff like that, the threat is that if we have Mulder and Scully type pairings, right, is that it's basically Scully's going to get creamed in stories like that a lot, because it's always going to turn out, wait, oh my goodness, it really was vampires. And we maybe create a situation in which the characters that are demonstrating things that we value and that we want to have, and that we had ought to appreciate that are laudable things. So things like a appreciation for things like not just appreciation for science, but also sort of like good judgment and sort of a certain amount of groundedness and a certain amount of like unwillingness to kind of go off on weird flights of fantasy and just suddenly start believing like, like tarot cards is real. Oh yeah, that sounds great. I think that's a good idea. Or like, oh, I heard a noise. I bet it's a ghost. These are actually not good impulses that we don't that we don't want to be fostering, and that we want to be fostering more Scully type impulses. So and I think maybe lots of people that like stories like this, I think would, in their own lives would sort of support that, but for some reason then because we want to sort of write these fun, and for different reasons we want to sort of include these fantastic elements, if we do that, then often we're put in the position of kind of beating down on Scully, who is actually somebody that maybe we don't want to beat down on, maybe we want to be giving this person some credit, more credit, but then the dynamic is going to allow it for. Okay, so a few different ways that we can handle this. One way is that you can just not care about it at all right? You can just sort of decide, like, yeah, okay, in my story, and maybe you have an extra grind behind this. Maybe you're actually sort of like, yeah, romanticism, reason, no, science, blah. We're talking. We want like sort of like feelings and instincts and ineffable, blah, 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 blah. And then if that's what you want, I guess you don't have a problem here. If that's what and this does put you in a little bit of a difficult situation, maybe. So because like let's say even if you're someone that does believe in the ability to influence the world supernaturally, which is not an uncommon thing. If you think that prayer will do this, or if you are some manner of witch or warlock, or you do tarot cards or whatever it is, and maybe you're thinking the sort of like, yeah, I kind of want to take rationality and science down a peg a little bit. I don't like that. I want to be supporting these other things. Then that's fine. But if you're actually consciously writing sort of fantasy and science fiction, then probably the thing that your sort of Scully character is getting creamed of is still different than the actual supernatural thing that you believe in the real world. Or if it isn't, then you're not actually writing fantasy and science fiction. You're just writing realistic fiction by your own lights. Which, again, if you're doing that, sort of that's great. But most of the time, I don't. I think that even if you do believe in some kind of whatever kind of supernatural thing you might happen to believe in, I still think you don't really get out of this problem, right? Okay, so that's one thing you can do. Another thing that you can do by way of solving this problem is to just completely not address it and let the dynamic play out. Again, not because of any ideological problem that you have, but just because it's kind of a pain in the neck to fix or to address, and people don't really mind all that much when you're writing commercial fiction and you just don't care, especially. This is an option. You can do that, all right? And sort of proceeding from here, I'm just going to assume that you're not going to be doing that. That you're maybe interested in doing something else, if for no other reason than because it might lead you into some more interesting directions, and it might put you in a position to present people with things that they're going to remember a little bit more, that they're going to find more, like, a little bit more stimulating, that they're more likely to talk to their friends about. Stuff like that. Okay. All right, so some other approaches that we could take to this. Okay, first up, we can give our Scully character the opportunity to adjust as soon as they start learning about whatever unusual elements are coming in, whatever fantasy or horror or science fiction things are happening. We can have this. She's a woman of science, or whatever version of this kind of character that we have. As soon as ghosts start showing up in a story that start doing empirical things, you can then stop and think, okay, all right, I'm a person that trusts the evidence of my own senses. There are ghosts now. I'm going for, clearly that's what's happening, right? Or if you're in sort of more of a kind of like a mixed bag universe where there are lots of different things going on, you can have this person adjust and sort of say, okay, until I got mixed up in all this business, werewolves would have been a trip too far for me, but I've seen my ghosts, I've seen my vampires. Okay, maybe I can't dismiss this out of hand. Doesn't mean I have to believe any random thing anybody tells me, but I can accept it. And I think that this is the direction that lots of like long-running series kind of eventually go into anyway, just because, again, if you're going to have a character who is sort of like standing up for the real world and is the person that the audience identifies with for purposes of having this schism between, the real world and then the fantastic elements that are invading the real world, that make you feel like, oh man, this is a different thing. Suddenly, as the series goes on, the person is just going to get used to fantastic elements. But just inevitably. But this is also something I think that you can steer into the skid here sort of for good effect, where you can sort of, by way of sort of showing, of preventing this person just from looking dumb, you can just have them like pretty aggressively, once things have changed, sort of say like, okay, I'm in favor of that now. Okay, or I understand that things were different than what I thought they were, then that I have more stuff to learn, and just sort of go after that aggressively as opposed to sort of getting dragged and kicking, streaming into it. And then the only one problem with that, and the reason that people are resistant to doing that sometimes, is again, if the reason that you introduced this character in the first place is to sort of ground the story and make the exceptional things or make the supernatural, like paradigm-breaking things feel to increase the otherness of those, just by giving us the chance to identify with somebody that doesn't want to accept these things and is forced to accept these things, you do sort of lose that dynamic a little bit. And maybe that's a bad thing, and maybe it's not. It's depending on what exactly you're writing. Okay, so that's one option. So another possibility, right, is out of our sort of Scully and Mulder dynamic, is just to make Mulder wrong. All right, and this is, I'm sure the X-Files was on it for a long time, and I didn't see every single episode, but I'm sure they hit this sooner or later. But I haven't seen, just because, again, by the nature of TV shows, it's going to be about doing variations on a theme and sort of like moving things around a little bit. But just to create a situation where, you can have a perfectly exciting story that's about a cult that doesn't involve space fungus, right? And maybe just having one character that's just sort of inclined to think, hey, maybe this is a space fungus from beyond time. That at a certain point, maybe by the fourth act or so, gets proven wrong, and then from there, it's just sort of about dealing with this insane cult, which is a perfectly reasonable story in itself. Doesn't mean you can't have space fungus later, or vampires later, or ghosts later, or whatever. But every so often, you can give the Scully character, or whatever representative of rationality and science that you happen to have lying around, give this person a win sometimes, right? All right, and it'll good because I think this is actually a really good way of sort of preserving this person's that tension, that if you're using this person sort of as a way of making sure that people are experiencing the otherness a little bit more by having somebody that doesn't just sort of accept this stuff. If you make it a little bit more of a miss and have every so often sort of see like, yeah, see, there's nothing supernatural going on there, just give them a win. Be careful, just make sure that you're doing that every so often. What else do we have here? Okay, another option, all right, is that you can make both sides of this wrong, right? But do that so basically, this is kind of a niche thing, because this is really sort of a hard thing to pull off. But in, let's say, something that is more, I think this more comes up most often in like Lovecraft, sort of Lovecraft influence horror, where the point of it is not just that we have a supernatural force that is sort of invading the world that we know it, and that is sort of intruding upon our world, but that this force is not merely something new that we then have to understand. Whether just sort of by understanding a new set of rational rules, or even by sort of relating to it intuitively or emotionally, some whatever hippy-dippy way you want to come up with. But that maybe this Lovecrafty thing that is invading our world is like actively something that is alien to our reason, that we can't understand. So a good way of impressing upon that is maybe we have Scully, we got Scully and Mulder coming across the space fungus from beyond time. And maybe Scully's credibility gets knocked off pretty quick because he doesn't accept the fungus. And then Mulder goes in thinking, okay, I understand the fungus. I'm not like Scully, I'm like a broody, intuitive person. I can sort of get this. And maybe he gets shellacked too, in which case that the larger point that we're dealing with is not that we're, ditching a scientific framework for some other thing, but that it's really impressing that the horror of this is that it doesn't just like ignore the scientific, rational part of things, but that it's invalidating it. That that we're really just attacking the very possibility that we can sort of make rules that we can and tell stories that we can use to understand the universe in a coherent way, and maybe we're striking against that. So that's kind of some heavy cream there, right? I mean, that's definitely not something anybody can do all the time, but if you can get across that feeling, often attempted, not always completely succeeded, but that's a strong feeling. I mean, there's a reason that people are still talking about Lovecraft and using Lovecraft's ideas all this time. Okay, and then finally, one last option, and not the last option, but the last option that one he prevents you with, and this is one that I'm fond of because it's one that I've used, especially used this in my Charlie Harmer stories, is, again, to have both sides be wrong, right? Where we have a Mulder, and then we have a Scully, and Scully is saying, okay, this is all explainable by science. We don't have any weird juju, floaty, glowy things going on here. And then we have Mulder saying, oh yeah, but we do have some glowy, glowy, floaty, supernatural magic, whatever you want to call it, things going on here. And I know what the rules for those things are. Scully's wrong once we introduce the supernatural element, and then Mulder turns out maybe to have some of his own biases, and maybe even, if you want to be a little bit sneaky, make some of these biases kind of similar to some of the biases that lead people to believe in supernatural things and sort of into the actual world. So let's say, and we're getting past the actual Sculder and Mully here right now, we're using them more as symbols, but let's say sort of we have the Mulder who is inclined to believe in ghosts and their friendliness because he has experienced loss in his life and he wants to feel a connection to the departed, and he's unwilling to accept that these people are gone. And so maybe that leads him to believe in ghosts, but then in the process of investigating these ghosts, we come to realize that these ghosts are not warm and fuzzy. Okay, maybe these are just sort of like, and this is not the actual plot of my story, but maybe these ghosts are just like terrifying evil creatures that offer no kind of comfort or connection, and that these are not the things that are happening. In which case, maybe Mulder does still have our Mulder character does have to go back to the drawing board and think sort of like, okay, there's supernatural stuff. I was right about that, but I still fell afraid of my biases, even though these supernatural things are happening, right? And the version of this that I did, that I'm kind of pleased with, just to talk about my own stuff for a second, is that in my novel, Charlie Harmer's Last Request, Charlie Harmer Takes a Ride. One of the main characters is one of those people that has if you're driving around in suburban areas or most places, it's kind of on the list of like bars and churches and nail salons, and things you see everywhere. People that claim to be able to do hand reading, or read the color of your aura, or connect you to the spirits of the departed, right? Con artists. These people aren't real. They can't claim they cannot do the things that they claim to do. All right, they are separating people from their money, and sometimes it's sometimes it's nasty, sometimes it's relatively benign, but it's not a real thing. And the character that I have in my story, 90% of the time, is also a con artist. Right, is not doing the things that she claims to do. Only that faint 10% of the time does it turn out that actually, if you speak loudly in public and say like, yes, I can deal with ghosts and I can connect to ghosts and I can connect you to your loved ones. Some of the time, then the actual sort of ghosts show up, but the relationship that she has with these ghosts is different than the relationship that she claims to have for most of the people that she is talking to, that she is running the scam on, right? And just to sort of establish that distinction, it's sort of, I like that because I like that much better than I like having a situation where which I've seen in like some horror movies and some others. Say I think in the horror movie that I liked. Called Drag Me to Hell, the Sam Raimi movie, where there's a protagonist that doesn't even believe in this stuff, that gets cursed by a witch, and then she has to go approach someone that she would not have taken seriously before, and she's forced to take, who is a storefront magic aura reading person, and she's forced to take this person seriously even though she didn't want to. That's kind of tough for me because I don't think she actually should take that person seriously, right? So if there can at least be a distinction where the sort of like, okay, yes, these people, where we can still make it clear that yes, these people are still bullshit, but we have our magical element here. It just works a little bit differently than what they're saying. That's one way, a good way of handling it. That introduces some humor and introduces different people treating each other in different ways, kind of, where it's sort of when somebody's talking, they're changing how they're talking depending on who they're talking to, which is always good stuff that I think is important. Grounded in the world, it's a way, all right? Definitely it's not the only way, so I'm very curious, as always, to hear what you guys have to say, and, see where you guys have maybe seen this dynamic come up. If there's something else I want to watch, something else I want to read, something else I should dig into, if I'm right, if I'm wrong. If I'm good looking, if I'm not so good looking, you tell me. I want to know. So down here, like, subscribe. You can join my mailing list, get a bunch of free ebooks. Click on the link, buy some of my other books, and we got new videos here once a week. Thank you for listening as always. Have a good night.